If yeast disappeared today, most people wouldn't just struggle to bake bread, they would stop completely, not because baking is difficult, but because they were never taught how it actually works. That's the part no one really says out loud. For years, baking has been simplified into one idea that sounds obvious but quietly limits everything. No yeast means no bread. The problem is that idea is completely wrong. And the moment you see why, you start to notice something uncomfortable about how most people approach baking. They're not bad at it. They're dependent on a single system they don't understand. And the moment that system disappears, everything collapses. Not the dough, but their confidence. That's when the questions start to pile up. What do I use instead? Is there a substitute? Can I even make bread anymore? And that line of thinking is exactly where things go wrong, because yeast was never the thing you needed. It was just the easiest way to hide what's actually happening underneath. Yeast doesn't make bread, it creates gas, and that's all it does. It feeds on sugars, releases carbon dioxide, and that gas gets trapped inside the dough, expanding and stretching the structure until you get the rise you associate with bread. So when people say you need yeast, what they really mean is you need a way to create gas and trap it effectively. Once you understand that, the entire conversation changes, because now you're not looking for substitutes, you're looking for systems. And there are only a few real systems that can do this reliably. Each one works, each one has been used for generations, and each one fails in a very specific way if you don't understand how it actually operates. Most people try one of these methods once, get a bad result, and assume it doesn't work. But the failure is almost never the method. It's the misunderstanding behind it. The difference between someone who struggles and someone who consistently gets results comes down to one thing: understanding the system instead of blindly following steps. The fastest system people reach for is chemical leavening, using baking powder or baking soda. And on the surface, it looks almost too simple to mess up. You add it to your mixture, combine it with liquid, and bake. But that simplicity hides a critical detail that most people completely miss. The reaction starts immediately, not in the oven and not later. But the moment liquid touches the leavening agent, gas begins forming right away. That creates a narrow window where everything has to happen correctly. And most people don't even realize that window exists. They mix their dough and then pause. Maybe to adjust something, maybe to stir a bit more, maybe to wait for the oven, and in that time the gas is already escaping. By the time the mixture goes into the oven, the reaction is largely finished, and there's nothing left to expand. The result is predictable: flat, dense, heavy bread that feels like a failure, and the assumption becomes that the method doesn't work. In reality, it works perfectly, but only if you respect its timing. The people who succeed with this method move quickly. They mix, shape, and bake without delay because they understand that this isn't about giving the dough time. It's about using the exact moment when the reaction is active. The trade-off is equally important, because while this method gives you speed and convenience, it sacrifices depth. There's no fermentation, no slow development of flavor, so the end result will always be simpler, and that's where expectations start to break things again. If you expect this system to behave like yeast, you'll always be disappointed. But if you use it for what it's designed to do, quick breads, biscuits, pancakes, and flatbreads, it becomes one of the most efficient tools you have. If speed isn't the priority, the next system takes you in the opposite direction and forces you to slow down completely. And this is where most people drop out. Sourdough replaces commercial yeast with wild yeast that already exists in your environment, in the air, on your hands, and in your kitchen. But unlike a packaged ingredient, you don't buy it, you grow it. It starts with something that feels almost too simple to matter: flour and water mixed together and left alone, and over time subtle changes begin to appear. Small bubbles form, a smell develops, activity increases, and eventually a living culture emerges. At that point, you're no longer just baking. You're maintaining something that responds to its environment, and that's where expectations clash with reality. Most people approach sourdough expecting the same predictability they get from commercial yeast. But this system doesn't operate on fixed timelines. Temperature, humidity, feeding schedules, and even location can change how it behaves. And when it doesn't respond immediately, people assume it's not working. That assumption is what causes most failures, because sourdough isn't something you control in the traditional sense. It's something you work with. Once that shift happens, the results start to improve in ways that feel almost surprising. The flavor becomes deeper. The texture becomes more complex. And the bread lasts longer without artificial support. At the same time, this method demands more from you, because it requires patience, consistency, and attention. And most people aren't willing to give that. That's why they return to yeast. Not because sourdough doesn't work, but because it asks for a level of involvement they weren't expecting. What makes this even more interesting is that not all methods depend on biology at all, and this is where the perspective changes again. Steam expansion relies on physics rather than organisms or chemical reactions, using the simple principle that water turns into steam when heated, and steam expands rapidly. That expansion creates pressure, and if the dough is structured correctly, that pressure forces it to rise. The idea itself is straightforward, but the execution is where most people fail, because they underestimate how much heat is required. Trying to be cautious, they lower the oven temperature, and in doing so they remove the very force that makes the system work. Steam needs intensity. It needs high heat to form quickly and expand aggressively, and without that the rise never happens. This is why foods like pita, popovers, and choux pastry behave the way they do, creating pockets, hollow centers, and crisp shells without any yeast at all. The result is very different from traditional bread, but the underlying principle is the same. Gas is created and trapped within a structure. Understanding that difference changes how you approach the method, because instead of expecting softness and uniformity, you start recognizing that each system produces its own kind of outcome. At this point, it becomes clear that creating gas isn't the only option, because there's a method that bypasses that step entirely. Mechanical aeration works by introducing air directly into the mixture, through physical action like whipping, beating, or folding, and then stabilizing that air during baking. This is how cakes and sponge-based textures achieve their rise, but it also introduces a new level of fragility that most people underestimate. Air is easy to destroy, and once it's lost, there's no way to recover it. Overmixing knocks it out, underbaking collapses it, and weak structure fails to hold it in place. This is where many people unintentionally sabotage their results, because they treat mixing as just another step, rather than the core mechanism of the method. The people who succeed understand that the way they handle the mixture determines everything that happens afterward, and they pay close attention to when to stop, how to preserve the structure, and how to support it during baking. Eggs often play a crucial role here, because they help stabilize the air bubbles and create a framework that can hold its shape under heat. Even then, this method has limitations, because it naturally produces lighter textures rather than dense, chewy bread, and expecting it to do otherwise leads to the same kind of disappointment seen in the other systems. The final method is one that has largely disappeared from modern practice, not because it doesn't work, but because it doesn't offer the control people have come to expect. Natural fermentation without a starter relies on time alone, allowing flour and water to sit until wild microorganisms begin to grow on their own. This process is slower and less predictable than sourdough, but it still produces gas and can create enough lift to form bread. The inconsistency is what pushed it out of common use, because some batches work well while others fail, and modern baking tends to avoid that level of uncertainty. Even so, it reveals something important about the nature of bread itself, because it shows that yeast, as most people think of it, was never strictly necessary. It was simply the most efficient and controllable way to achieve a result that can be reached through multiple paths. Looking at all of these methods together changes the way you think about baking, because it becomes clear that the process isn't defined by a single ingredient, but by a set of systems that all solve the same problem in different ways. Whether it's chemical reactions, wild fermentation, steam expansion, mechanical aeration, or natural microbial growth, the goal is always the same: create gas and trap it within a structure that can hold it long enough to expand. Once you understand that, the limitations most people feel start to disappear because you're no longer tied to one approach. You're able to choose the system that fits the result you want, rather than trying to force every situation into the same framework. This is also where a more uncomfortable truth becomes visible, because even when people do have yeast, they still run into problems. They rush fermentation, ignore temperature, misjudge timing, and then assume the recipe is at fault when the result isn't what they expected. The issue isn't the instructions, it's the lack of understanding behind them. Following steps can only take you so far, because without knowing why those steps matter, it becomes impossible to adjust when something changes. The difference between someone who consistently succeeds and someone who keeps struggling comes down to recognizing the system at work and making decisions based on that awareness. When you reach that point, the way you respond to situations changes completely. Running out of yeast no longer feels like a problem, because you're not dependent on it anymore. Instead of searching for a substitute, You decide which system makes sense for what you're trying to achieve. If speed matters, chemical leavening becomes the obvious choice. If flavor and depth are the goal, sourdough provides that complexity. If you're aiming for structure driven by heat, steam expansion becomes the focus. If lightness is the priority, mechanical aeration offers a direct way to build it. If you're willing to experiment and accept inconsistency, natural fermentation becomes an option again. Each method has its place, and understanding when to use it is what creates consistent results. At that stage, something else becomes clear because you stop asking whether you have the right ingredient and start asking how to produce the effect you need. That shift might seem small, but it changes everything about how you approach baking. It moves you from dependency to control, from following instructions to understanding outcomes, and from uncertainty to intentional decisions. Bread was never about yeast in the first place. It was about transformation, taking something simple like flour and water and turning it into something that can hold air, hold heat, and hold structure. Yeast made that transformation easier, but it also made it easier to overlook what was really happening. Once you see the process for what it is, that dependency disappears. And the next time yeast isn't available, you're not stuck trying to figure out what to do. You already know how to create the result you want.